Can I borrow your dad for today? What? Yeontan turned, blinking at the tall man standing near the piano, arms crossed, watching the recital preparations with the same unreadable calm he wore into every room. I'll bring him back before the recital ends. Yeontan tilted his head. My dad? She nodded. He frowned. Why? The girl looked toward the auditorium's doors, the way she'd been looking at them for the last 20 minutes, as if someone might still walk through if she watched long enough. Then she looked back at him. I'll tell you after the duet. The teacher's voice rang out before Yeontan could ask anything else. Parent and child duet pairs, please make your way to the stage. Around them, the room shifted into motion. Mothers straightening bow ties, fathers adjusting sheet music, children tugging sleeves toward the wings. The girl didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, small hands wrapped around the strap of her recital folder, eyes drifting once more toward the entrance. Grandma Bear heard every word. She had arrived early with a tin of rice cakes, a thermos of tea, and the particular determination of a woman who intended to make an ordinary Tuesday recital feel like an occasion. Yeontan slowly turned toward his father. Appa? The man, tall and composed, dressed like every ordinary parent in the room, except for the two men who'd quietly taken up position near the exits, looked from Yeontan to the girl. Her dress was pressed. Her shoes were new. Nothing about her looked neglected. And yet, the way she kept watching that door made something tighten in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel at a children's piano recital. Parent and child duet pairs, final call, the teacher said again. Yeontan leaned close to his father and murmured, just loud enough for the girl to hear. Can we let her borrow you? The girl looked down immediately, as though she hadn't expected the question to be said out loud. The Mafia boss, a man used to silence answering for him in every other room he entered, crouched down until he was level with her. What's your name? She answered without hesitation. Grace. Grace, he said, his voice gentler than Yeontan had heard in a long time. Are you certain your mother isn't coming? Something shifted across her face, small, just a tightening at the corners of her mouth. She glanced at the door once more. She said she'd try. He didn't ask another question. He only held out his hand. Then until she arrives, you'll play with us. Grace looked at his hand. Then at Yeontan. Yeontan gave her one serious nod, the kind that seemed to settle something official. Borrowing approved. For a second, Grace looked almost startled by that. Then the smallest breath of a laugh slipped out of her, quick and involuntary, gone almost as it appeared. They lined up at the piano bench together, Yeontan sliding over to make room. Grandma Bear steadied the sheet music stand from behind. The recital coordinator raised a hand for quiet. Grace whispered, left hand first. Yeontan whispered back, your left or my left? Grace frowned. There are two lefts? The coordinator's hand dropped. They started together, stumbled slightly on the second measure, and Grandma Bear's soft laugh from behind them made Grace's shoulders relax by half an inch. Yeontan looked startled, like the sound had caught him off guard. Then Grace leaned toward him mid-song and whispered, Come on, borrowed brother. I'm not your brother, he murmured back, fingers still moving. Teasingly, only until the recital ends. That time, Yeontan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, gone before it fully arrived. But Do-hyun, watching from the front row, saw it, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it made his chest tighten in a way 3 years of quiet dinners never had. They didn't play it perfectly. Grace blamed the tempo. Yeontan blamed her counting. Do-hyun, still watching, blamed neither of them and forgot for a few minutes to check his phone. When the applause came, families swarmed the aisles, parents hugging their children, phones raised, flowers exchanged. Yeontan tugged Grace to the reception table, where Grandma Bear had already laid out a tin of rice cakes and a thermos of barley tea like she'd been preparing for this exact moment for days. "Now you have to eat with us," Yeontan said. Grace hesitated. "That's okay. I'm fine." Grandma Bear opened the tin without looking up. "You don't like rice cakes?" "I didn't say that." Grace glanced at the tin, then at Yeontan, then back at Grandma Bear. "This is for your family." Yeontan patted the space on the bench beside him. "You borrowed us today. Sit." Grace stayed standing. Grandma Bear set a small plate down anyway, 2 rice cakes, a cluster of grapes, a cup of tea, placing it beside Yeontan's plate like it had always belonged there. "There's plenty." Grace sat slowly. She picked up a rice cake with both hands but didn't eat right away. She only looked at it. Concernedly, Grandma Bear watched her closely. "Something wrong, little one?" Grace shook her head fast. "No." "Then why aren't you eating?" Her fingers tightened slightly around the rice cake. Her voice dropped. "Emotionally, nobody's ever saved me a snack before." Yeontan stopped chewing. Stunned, Do-hyun, standing just behind them, went very still. The reception hall stayed loud around them, parents laughing, a teacher calling names off a clipboard, but at that small folding table, everything narrowed to a single quiet point. Embarrassed, Grace seemed to realize she'd said more than she meant to. Quickly, she took a quick bite. "It's good," she said, too fast, too polite. Emotionally, Grandma Bear looked away for a moment, just long enough to steady her own face. Gently, Yeontan slid his cup of tea across the table. "You can have mine, too." Confused, Grace glanced at it. "I already have one." "I know." "Then why give me another?" Simply, Yeontan shrugged, echoing something he'd clearly learned recently. Innocently, "Because borrowed people need extra." Warmly, that did it. Happily, a real smile broke across Grace's face, small but real. Thoughtfully, Do-hyun saw it. And at that exact moment, near the auditorium's front entrance, a sleek black sedan pulled sharply into the drop-off circle. A few parents glanced over. The car didn't belong beside the minivans and family sedans lining the curb. Too dark, too polished, too expensive. Grace heard the engine before she saw the car. Her smile disappeared. Do-hyun noticed. The sedan stopped near the entrance. Urgently, a woman stepped out in a tailored coat, phone still pressed to her ear. Her expression composed, but her eyes scanning the crowd with barely restrained urgency. Relief. The moment she spotted Grace, something like relief broke across her face. She started walking quickly toward the reception table. Most children who spotted a late parent would have run to them. Grace didn't. She stayed seated at the folding table, rice cake still in her hands, and simply watched her mother approach. Do-hyun looked between the woman and the girl, then back again. And the question that had started with one strange sentence at the piano bench became something heavier. Why wouldn't a child who'd spent the entire afternoon watching a door run to her parent the moment they finally arrived? For a few seconds, neither mother nor daughter moved. The reception hall stayed loud around them. Emotionally, Claire Bellamy saw only one thing. Her 7-year-old daughter was still holding a rice cake someone else had set aside for her. Relief crossed her face first. Guilt followed immediately after. She crouched in front of Grace. "I'm sorry." No excuse about the board call, no mention of the flight delay. Just those 2 words. Grace looked at her quietly, then gave one small nod. She'd been disappointed before, enough times to know her mother never broke a promise on purpose. That understanding hurt Claire far more than anger would have. A child shouldn't have to become that patient. Gratefully, before leaving, Grace turned back to Yeontan and Grandma Bear and offered a small, careful bow. "Thank you for letting me borrow your family." Grandma Bear smiled. "And thank you for bringing our borrowed guest's mother back before the recital hall closed." Something shifted in the air. Grace almost smiled. Almost. Claire introduced herself quietly to Do-hyun, apologized for interrupting the afternoon, and thanked Grandma Bear for looking after her daughter. She studied him for a moment, this composed, quiet man who'd apparently spent the last hour making sure her daughter didn't sit alone. Not the intimidating stranger she might have expected from the security posted discreetly near the doors. Just a father who'd noticed a child no one else had. As they turned to leave, Claire said something she hadn't planned to say. Children don't remember the expensive days. They remember the happy ones. Do-hyun didn't answer, but he didn't forget it either. The black sedan pulled away from the recital hall. Inside, Grace sat quietly by the window, still holding the extra cup Yeontan had insisted she keep. Neither she nor her mother spoke much on the drive home. Claire kept her eyes on the road, aware for the first time in a long while that she didn't know what to ask her own daughter. Back at the Kang estate, the gates swang open in perfect silence. Grandma Bear went ahead into the house, humming to herself, tin of leftover rice cakes tucked under one arm. Thoughtfully, Do-hyun lingered by the car a moment longer than necessary, still turning Claire's sentence in his mind. That evening, in his study, Suho set a new file on the desk and noticed his employer staring out the window instead of reading. "Sir?" Do-hyun looked up. "You've mentioned the woman from the recital 3 times tonight." "I asked one question." Suho kept his expression neutral. "You asked 3. Do-hyun had no answer for that. He turned back toward the window. "Did Yeontan seem different to you today?" Suho answered without hesitation. "He laughed, sir, more than once." The room went quiet. After a long pause, Do-hyun spoke without turning. "I haven't heard that in a while." Suho chose his next words carefully. "There were some things even we can't arrange, sir." The study stayed silent after that. Do-hyun already understood the rest of it himself. 3 years since Yeontan's mother had disappeared into a rival family's protection after the divide between the 2 houses turned violent. 3 years of nannies who followed schedules perfectly and loved Yeontan faithfully, and somehow still hadn't managed to fill a house that had stopped being lived in and started merely being managed. When Claire discovered what Julian had done, the marriage ended within the month. Custody went to her. Trust went with it. Every young nanny she'd hired since had been replaced within weeks. She couldn't stop herself from wondering who they were really reporting to. Eventually, she stopped hiring anyone under 60. They loved Grace faithfully, fed her, kept her safe. But somewhere along the way, the penthouse had stopped being lived in. It was only managed. The next morning followed its usual order. Breakfast, homework review, piano practice. Everything precisely where it belonged. Warmly, Mrs. Alcott smiled as she set the day's schedule beside Grace's breakfast. "Your mother asked if there's anything you'd like after school." Usually, the answer came immediately: a new book, a puzzle, an extra piano lesson. Thoughtfully, today, Grace was quiet. She looked up at Claire. Hopefully. "Mom, can I visit Yeontan?" The dining room went still. Uneasily, Mrs. Alcott glanced at Claire. The other staff paused mid-motion. Reflectively, it wasn't an expensive request. It wasn't even a complicated one. And yet somehow it caught everyone off guard. Thoughtfully, Claire studied her daughter for a long moment. Reflectively, she'd expected another reward for a good week, a toy, a trip, something with a price tag attached. Instead, her daughter wanted to spend an afternoon with a boy she'd known less than 2 days. She nodded slowly. "All right." A small smile crossed Grace's face before she caught it and tucked her head back down over her cereal. Reflectively, something about her had already shifted. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't looking forward to something that could be bought. Thoughtfully, Claire watched her daughter in silence, then looked out the dining room window. Ominously, she had no idea that saying yes to one ordinary after-school visit was about to unravel every routine her household had run on for years. Calm, that same morning, Claire drove Grace to school herself. Reflectively, the question from breakfast sat between them the entire ride. Softly, "Can I visit Yeontan?" At the gate, Do-hyun was already there with Yeontan. Yeontan spotted Grace first. "My borrowed sister." Grace looked at him calmly. "I'm still not your sister. We'll fix that later." Claire greeted Do-hyun politely. He returned it with the same quiet respect. They'd met only the day before, but something about two children sharing one recital, one snack, and one strange promise had already made two strangers feel oddly familiar. Claire didn't waste time. Grace asked if she could visit after school. Do-hyun looked at Yeontan, who stood quietly beside him, waiting. He smiled faintly. "Of course." Yeontan clacked once. "Borrowed sister is coming." The bell rang. The children hurried in together. Halfway to the entrance, Yeontan was already talking with both hands. Grace mostly listened, but she walked beside him, not behind him, not alone. Do-hyun noticed. That small detail stayed with him longer than it should have. That afternoon, Claire came back herself. No driver, no extra staff, only Priya, her assistant. For a woman who'd spent years building walls after betrayal, leaving her daughter in a stranger's home on the first visit was unthinkable without seeing it herself. Do-hyun's house was nothing like the Bellamy penthouse. No security gate, no marble foyer, no silent hallway. Just a modest home with flowers along the front steps, crayon drawings taped near the window, and a small vegetable garden running along the side fence. The moment the door opened, Grace noticed two things. The first was the noise, a pot simmering somewhere in the kitchen, Yeontan dropping his backpack in the hallway without anyone flinching. The second was the smell, butter, syrup, warm pancakes. A plate sat cooling on the dining table beside a bowl of fruit. Yeontan's eyes lit up. He glanced toward the hallway, then lowered his voice. "Grandma Bear made those." Grace eyed the plate. "Shouldn't we ask first?" Yeontan looked at her like she'd said something deeply unreasonable. "If we ask first, she'll say no." Before Grace could argue, he pressed a pancake in her hand. She froze. He took one for himself. She glanced toward the kitchen. Do-hyun was getting drinks, then toward the doorway where Claire stood quietly taking in the small, noisy house. Grace looked back at the pancake. Yeontan had already taken a bite. She took one careful bite of her own. Her eyes widened. Yeontan grinned. "See?" She nodded before she could stop herself. That was when heavy footsteps sounded from the hallway. A short, sturdy woman entered with a bag of flour tucked under one arm, silver hair escaping its bun in several directions, as though she'd been losing an argument with the kitchen all morning. A faded apron covered her clothes, flour dusted across both hands and one cheek. She stopped, counted the pancakes. Once, twice. Her sharp eyes moved from Yeontan to Grace to the half-eaten pancake sitting on the plate like evidence at a crime scene. Then, one flour-dusted finger rose slowly. "Who stole my pancakes?" Yeontan pointed at Grace without hesitation. "It was the borrowed sister." Grace's eyes went wide. "You gave it to me." Grandma Bear gasped, delighted. "So we have a thief and an accomplice." Yeontan shrieked with laughter and bolted. For 1 second, Grace didn't move. Then, Grandma Bear took one dramatic step forward, and Grace ran too. The old woman chased both children through the yard with startling speed, apron flapping, flour still on her cheek, a wooden spoon raised like a gavel. Stunned, Grace glanced back over her shoulder. Astonished. Grandmothers can sprint? Grandma Bear finally stopped near the garden fence, catching her breath, flour still smudged across her face. Cheerfully, she looked at Grace. "Impressed? You run fast." Grace answered honestly. "I thought you were actually going to catch me." Grandma Bear looked personally offended. "Catch you?" She straightened with great dignity. "Protecting my knees." Yeontan burst out laughing. "You were losing." Grandma Bear folded her arms. "I was demonstrating mercy." A pause. "Wisely, I've reached the age where I let children believe they're winning." She looked toward the kitchen, then back at both of them. "Officially, the suspect will now step forward." Grace raised her hand quietly. "I ate one." Grandma Bear nodded slowly, deeply impressed. "I like this one. She confesses before the trial even starts." She turned to Claire and extended one flour-covered hand. "Friendly, I'm Boon-hee, but don't call me grandmother. It makes my knees hurt. Call me Grandma Bear." Before Claire could respond, Yeontan grinned. Happily, everyone just calls her Grandma Bear. Calmly, Do-hyun appeared from the kitchen carrying drinks. Apologetically, "I apologize. She argues with everyone." Grandma Bear looked scandalized. "I don't argue. I simply explain why I'm correct." Grace laughed. A real laugh, not the polite one she gave adults on cue. Real. Thoughtfully. Because this house didn't treat an ordinary afternoon like something to schedule. It treated it like something worth celebrating. Do-hyun offered Claire tea. She declined politely. He offered coffee. She declined again. Grandma Bear leaned toward Claire, whispering loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Don't worry, dear. We'll fix her." Claire blinked. "I'm sorry?" Grandma Bear smiled peacefully. "Nobody survives this house without eventually accepting something warm to drink." From the doorway, Priya pressed her lips together carefully. Nobody noticed Grace had already drifted closer to Grandma Bear, not because of the pancakes, not because of the chase, but because for the first time in a long while, an adult wasn't treating childhood like a schedule to maintain. Grandma Bear treated it like something that deserved to be enjoyed. The visits became routine without anyone officially deciding they should. Nobody planned it. It simply happened. Some afternoons, Grace finished her homework at the penthouse and then asked the same quiet question, "Can we go to Yeontan's?" Claire always pretended to think it over before nodding every single time. One Saturday, Grandma Bear appeared in the garden with 3 brightly colored water guns, setting them down with great ceremony. Championship rules. Grace picked hers immediately. What are the rules? Simple. Grandma Bear held up one finger. First person to surrender loses. Yeontan eyed his water gun, then hers. Complainingly, why is yours bigger? Innocently, Grandma Bear looked down at it as if noticing for the first time. Proudly, experience. That's not a rule. It is now. Grace was already filling hers at the tap. She leaned toward Yeontan and whispered, "Same time." "On 3, he whispered back. Grandma Bear was still explaining the championship rules to no one in particular. Double points for accuracy, which naturally favors seniority. 1, Grace murmured. 2, Yeontan murmured. Grandma Bear turned. Now, before we begin, 3. Water hit her from both sides at once. She gasped, staggered, slipped slightly on the wet grass, and grabbed the fence. Quickly, both children reloaded instantly. "Surrender!" Yeontan shouted. Grandma Bear straightened with enormous dignity, dripping, her hair completely flattened. "I do not surrender." Grace looked at her seriously. "Grandma Bear, your story is over." Grandma Bear wiped water from her eyes. "That," she said, "was chapter 1. Both children groaned. They soaked her again anyway. Later, the smell of something burning drifted out from the kitchen before anyone said a word. Grandma Bear paused, lifted her nose, sniffed once. Charcoal. Do-hyun appeared at the back door holding a spatula, looking genuinely wounded. "They're not charcoal, they're rustic." Grandma Bear turned to the children with the expression of someone presenting evidence in court. 15 years, every single Saturday, rustic. Grace glanced at Yeontan. Yeontan shook his head slowly. "Don't get involved." Grandma Bear pointed her spoon at her son. "You're welcome to let someone competent handle it." Do-hyun's eyes lit up, mock affronted. "I've been waiting 15 years to hear you say that." That evening, in her office, Claire barely noticed Priya setting a new folder on her desk until she realized she'd been staring at the window instead of the page in front of her. "Ma'am." Claire looked up. "You've mentioned him 3 times tonight." "I asked one question." Priya kept her expression neutral. "You asked 3. Claire had no answer for that. She looked back toward the window. Softly. "Did Grace seem different to you today?" Priya answered without hesitation. Warmly. She laughed, more than once. The room went quiet. After a long pause, Claire spoke without turning. "I haven't heard that in a while." Priya chose her next words carefully. "There are some things a schedule can't fix." Claire said nothing else. She already understood the rest herself. That same afternoon, while the children chased each other through the garden, Claire stood beside Grandma Bear near the fence. For a while, neither spoke. They simply watched. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "How did you raise someone like Do-hyun?" Grandma Bear smiled without looking away from her son, currently attempting to salvage a pan of pancakes with visible desperation. "I stopped trying to raise a perfect child." She watched Yeontan tackle Grace with a water balloon. "I just made sure he always knew he was loved." The sentence had no particular weight when it left the air, but it settled somewhere deep in Claire and refused to leave. She'd spent years giving Grace everything money could arrange: the perfect apartment, the perfect schedule, the perfect security. She'd solved every problem she could see. She had never once stopped to ask what her daughter actually felt. That same night, long after Yeontan had fallen asleep, Do-hyun stepped onto the porch and found Grandma Bear already there, 2 mugs of tea in hand. She passed him one without asking questions. They listened to the crickets. Finally, Do-hyun spoke. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough for him." Grandma Bear smiled. "When you were small, I worried about the exact same thing." Do-hyun looked at her. "You?" "Every single day." She took a slow sip. "Good parents aren't the ones with all the answers. They're the ones who keep showing up." Reflectively, Do-hyun looked down at his cup. Softly, the worry didn't disappear, but it felt lighter. Weeks earlier, Grace had counted the minutes until bedtime. Now she counted the days until the next visit. Observantly, Mrs. Alcott noticed first. Grace humming on the stairs, smiling to herself for no visible reason. One afternoon, she heard quiet laughter drifting from Grace's room, replaying something only she could hear. Mrs. Alcott stood outside the door a moment, then smiled to herself. The penthouse was still quiet. It no longer felt empty. Even Claire nearly laughed. The second man looked around. Neighbors were already opening their doors. Someone shouted the police were on their way. His nerve broke. He ran. The gate banged shut behind him. The trapped man stopped struggling, mostly because Grandma Bear had settled in and showed no intention of moving. "You had one job. Leave." She glanced down. Dryly, "You chose Chapter 5 instead." Do-hyun's car turned onto the street moments before the police arrived. He was out before it fully stopped, Suho half a step behind him. Both of them had spent the entire drive bracing for the worst. Instead, they found Grandma Bear sitting on a man in the garden, apron ruined, expression completely at peace. Suho stopped walking, stared, then cleared his throat carefully. "Sir?" Do-hyun looked at him. Matter-of-factly, "I believe my mother has already resolved the situation." The tension that had gripped him since the phone call cracked wide open. Hurriedly, he crossed the garden in 3 strides, eyes moving fast. "Yeontan? Grace? Uma!" Steadily, his son met his eyes and nodded once. "I'm okay." Do-hyun exhaled for the first time since his phone had rung. Then he looked properly at Grace, not hiding behind anyone, standing steady beside his mother. He looked at her like he was seeing something for the first time. Police sirens grew louder down the street. Grandma Bear patted the man almost kindly. "I did warn you." The garden slowly went quiet. A paramedic checked her shoulder. She waved him off. "I've had worse disagreements with lawnmowers." He checked it anyway. Claire covered her mouth. Grandma Bear caught the look. "Don't laugh, it undermines my authority." Claire laughed anyway. The man didn't last long under questioning. He wasn't dangerous. He was frightened. His phone held everything investigators needed. Messages, recordings, transfers, all pointing to the same person. Julian walked into the police station like he'd already been warned. Julian walked in like he was arriving for a meeting. Chin up, composed, assured. He expected a misunderstanding he could talk his way out of. Instead, a phone was placed on the table in front of him. A recording began. His own voice filled the room. Don't hurt anyone, just frighten them, especially the woman. His composure cracked. Defensively, he tried a different angle. I only wanted them to. The text messages followed. Every exit closed before he reached it. He looked across the table at Claire. She hadn't said a word since she'd walked in. She simply sat there and let the evidence do what she wouldn't. Officially, the investigator stood. Mr. Bellamy, you're under arrest. As officers moved beside him, he looked at Claire one last time. He's replacing me. It wasn't really a question. Claire answered anyway. Gently. No. Her voice was quiet. You lost that place yourself. Julian looked down. For the first time, the real fear underneath everything else surfaced. He hadn't been afraid of Do-hyun. He'd been afraid of what he saw in that garden. His daughter laughing, reaching for other people first, trusting a family he'd never built for her. Regretfully, he hadn't lost custody years ago. He'd lost her trust, slowly, without noticing, until it was simply gone. That evening, everyone gathered at the Kang house. The broken flower pots had been moved aside. The damaged gate leaned against the fence. The garden sat quieter than usual. Grandma Bear sat between the children on the porch steps, one hand on each of their shoulders, checking them every few minutes. The way someone checks a door they want to be certain is still locked. Claire stood near the damaged fence for a long time. Finally, Do-hyun walked over. You didn't have to come back tonight. She looked at the broken gate, the disturbed garden, the children sitting too quietly on the steps. Then at Grandma Bear, pretending her shoulder didn't hurt. Yes, I did. Do-hyun was quiet. Why? Tenderly, Claire looked at her daughter. Reflectively, Grace was sitting close to Yeontan. Not hiding, not frightened, just exactly where she felt safest. Because this is the first place my daughter ever looked like she was home. The words landed softly. Neither of them moved. Reflectively, the sentence didn't need an answer. It just needed to be heard. The next morning, workers arrived to reinforce the property with new gates, cameras, and lighting. Reflectively, Do-hyun stood at the kitchen window watching. When Claire came inside, he handed her tea without speaking. She accepted it without thinking. I never asked for this. I know. He looked out at the workers. I'm not protecting a house. He looked at her. I'm protecting the people inside it. Claire held her cup with both hands, looked down at it, didn't answer. Reflectively, but something in her shoulders changed, like a weight she'd carried alone for a long time had finally been set down. Several weeks later, long after the house had gone quiet, Claire sat alone in her office. A document waited unsigned on her desk. Instead, she opened the security feed on her laptop, one Do-hyun had set up so she could check in on Grace during her visits. Grandma Bear was mid-story. Which reminds me of 1986. 3 voices groaned at once. Grandma Bear smiled. Fine, 1987. Yeontan laughed. Do-hyun tried and failed to stop everyone from eating cookies before dinner. Then Claire heard it. Her daughter's laugh. Full, unguarded, free. She watched the screen without moving. Her hand came up slowly and covered her mouth. Then, almost too quietly to hear, I forgot what her laugh sounded like. The office stayed completely still. Outside the window, the city moved on. Inside, A mother sat alone with a screen full of laughter and the quiet understanding that the most important thing her wealth had ever done for her daughter was bring her to a small house with flowers by the door, burnt pancakes on Saturday mornings, and an old woman who never let happy memories escape. That evening, Grandma Bear called Grace onto the porch steps. She sat down beside her without saying anything at first. They simply looked out at the garden together. The tomato plants, the fence they'd repaired, the patch of grass still slightly flattened from the water gun championship. Then she reached into her apron pocket and placed a worn notebook into Grace's hands. Grace looked down at it, then up at her. "I can't take this." Grandma Bear smiled. Warmly. Gently. "I already filled it." Grace slowly opened the first page, written in large, careful handwriting. Reflectively. The day a little girl borrowed a father. Her throat tightened. She turned the pages. Small memories filled every line. Yeontan blamed her for the pancakes immediately. Grandmothers can sprint. First real laugh. The recital. Second duet. Shared cup of tea. Water gun defeat, according to unreliable witnesses. And more. Her throat tightened. She turned the pages. Small memories filled every line. Yeontan blamed her for the pancakes immediately. Grandmothers can sprint. First real laugh. The recital. Second duet. Shared cup of tea. Water gun defeat, according to unreliable witnesses. And more. "He asked me for a notebook once too," Grandma Bear said. "My son never showed me what he wrote on his first page. I think I already know." Grace stopped at that line. Read it twice. Her eyes went watery. She closed the notebook carefully, held it against her chest, and leaned into Grandma Bear's side without a word. Grandma Bear put one arm around her. Neither spoke. The garden was quiet. The evening light was nearly gone. Everything that mattered had already been written down. After a long while, Grandma Bear spoke, very softly. "One day, you'll forget the dates." Grace listened. "You'll forget the weather." She tapped the notebook once against Grace's chest, warmly. "But don't forget how today felt." Grace nodded. She didn't trust her voice enough to answer. Do-hyun found Claire standing near the garden fence a little while later. He was watching Grace through the window. She was inside now, sitting at the kitchen table, carefully writing something on a page. Claire stood beside him. Neither spoke for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Thank you." Do-hyun shook his head. "No. Sincerely. You gave her what I couldn't." Claire looked at him. She looked at him level that time. "You let her come here." She said it softly. "A man who trusts almost no one. That wasn't a small thing." Do-hyun met her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The kitchen light fell across her face. He noticed things he'd been careful not to notice before. The way she spoke about his family like she already belonged to it. The way she was still standing here, at the end of everything, still finding something kind to say. Something shifted in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He almost said it. Whatever it was right there. Then, Grandma Bear's voice exploded through the back door. "Do-hyun, if you're done standing around abandoning your own mother, I have an announcement." Claire looked away first, pressing her lips together. Do-hyun exhaled slowly. From the corner of the garden, Suho studied the sky with great professional interest. Inside, Yeontan opened one eye, then closed it, smiling. Grandma Bear was standing in the middle of the garden when they came back outside. Arms folded. Expression extremely serious. "I have been thinking." Yeontan looked at Grace. Grace looked at Yeontan. Neither moved. Grandma Bear looked at Grace directly. "You came here to borrow a father." Grace nodded carefully. And then you borrowed a brother. Yeontan grinned. And a grandmother. Grandma Bear raised one finger. I prefer Grandma Bear. Grandma Bear. Yeontan corrected immediately, as if she'd said anything different. Grandma Bear closed her eyes briefly, then looked back at Grace. So, are you done borrowing? Grace was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then Yeontan spoke for her. Can I keep my borrowed sister? Grace looked at him. Only if I can keep borrowing your family. Grandma Bear's voice came immediately. No borrowing? Everyone looked at her. She smiled. The kind of smile that meant she'd been waiting to say this for a long time. We're keeping everybody. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Claire quietly placed one hand on Grace's shoulder. Grace looked at her mother, then at Yeontan, then at Do-hyun, then back at Grandma Bear. Grace smiled through tears. For the first time in her life, she understood something no amount of money could ever buy. Family wasn't always the one you were born into. Sometimes it was the one that chose to keep you. And in that little house with flowers by the door, burnt pancakes on Saturday mornings, and a grandmother everyone called Grandma Bear, nobody was borrowed anymore. They were home. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Who was your favorite character? Grace, Yeontan, Do-hyun, Claire, or the unforgettable Grandma Bear? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next emotional story. We'll see you in the next one.